Thank you. It's great to see such a group of friendly faces and old friends and maybe new friends. I just want to thank a few people. Anna, thank you for helping to collect the images. Valerie, thank you for launching such a wonderful symposium, and I hope that you all find great success as you continue to do this annually in the future. I want to thank Frederico Vigil for coming and for taking the time to talk with me about his project last week. But it actually turned into a much more special conversation because we talked a lot more about the project that he's working on right now. And it is just an amazing experience to get to see a fresco come to life and being painted. And so if you've not had the opportunity to go to the convention center where he is painting his current history of winemaking in the region and Mexico, I strongly encourage you to do so. And I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to see his studio where he's been working with students. So not only is he creating this wonderful fresco that we will enjoy certainly for our lifetimes, but he's passing along an art to a younger generation. The thing that I found fascinated by most was the techniques and methods that he showed me that his students were really pushing him to explore new ways of thinking about doing fresco. So it's a wonderful combination of tradition and young people looking to the past and also looking to the future. So thank you for that, Frederico. I'm not going to talk a lot about the process of fresco today. I think it would be, if we want to talk about that, we can afterwards if Frederico is willing. It is a very long and thought out process that involves a lot of research, a lot of conversation. And for example, when Frederico was preparing for the Mundos de Mestizaje fresco that we're going to be talking about today, he had a whole panel of Ph.D.s that were researching and discussing and talking about the different histories that he was going to tell in his murals. So there's no way that I could do the expanse of that project justice in just one talk. So I hope that today we can shed some light on a few small components, and then I'll be more than happy to have larger discussion and questions at the end. So when I was preparing for this talk, I really was thinking about a couple of different ways of approaching this topic. And it reminded me of a book that I've read relatively recently. It's entitled New Spain to Mexico by Magali Carrera. And in her book, she explores how maps did more than record and locate land and places. The map, in some ways, became the face of the nation and contributed to the shaping of a national identity in 19th century Mexico. Carrera describes the process of taking the earth, which is a three-dimensional geometric form, and rendering it flat, what she calls the God's eye view. She argues that maps and the borders that they delineate are often used to create, analyze, and structure the world. Despite the fact that many view cartography as an objective endeavor, it's in fact quite messy. And in some ways, maps tell the stories of not only place and politics, but of time and people. So I'm just going to share a few maps with you that really kind of talk about the history of this place, of New Mexico, and really our country in a lot of ways. So it does have a larger national expanse, but today we're really going to try to focus on New Mexico. So in the first map that you'll see, sorry, I'm trying to follow along on my computer with the slides. This is actually a map of North America before the contact with Spain, or Europe, I should say. And so what you see here is actually all of the different And I wish it were clearer for you to be able to see all of the different tribes, but you get a sense that the New World was not this unpopulated expanse of land that was ready and available to be conquered. There were diverse peoples here with many different languages, traditions, cultures. And so this idea that somehow we discovered a new world and that it was just available is sort of an interesting story, but one that this map certainly indicates was not the case at all. If you can show the next one.
Can you go back and read the ones that are right in New Mexico?
Sure.
Yeah.
So right in here, it's Navajo. Let's see if I can see it better on my screen. I can. Hopi, Navajo, Zuni, Rio Grande Pueblos, and the Apaches. That's what's listed in the New Mexico space. Okay. And here's an example of a map of New Spain. And when this was from 1819, so you can see here already that Louisiana is part of the United States. For a long time, the Louisiana Purchase was really that whole center part of the United States, but by this time you see that Louisiana and Florida are already part of the country. But also notice the expanse of the Spanish territory, how far up it goes into what today we would call the United States, right? The next slide. This is a map of Mexico, the United States of Mexico, from 1826. So here you still get that same sense of how much of the United States was actually a part of Mexico during this time period. And then the last map I'll show you is really one that's a couple of different layers. So you see in the underlying layer the current boundaries for the United States. And on top of that, you see the different territorial acquisitions, right? That's a very, Alan, it was funny, I was having a conversation with my husband this morning. He said, acquisition. That's quite a passive word, isn't it? So maybe US territorial conquests might be a more accurate labeling of this map, but it's called acquisitions. And so you can see how over time, the United States became what we currently see as these sort of political borders that we now accept. So what does all this have to do with Federico Vigil and Mundos de Mestizaje? Why are we looking at all of these maps to have this discussion? Well, I believe, and if you've ever stood in the center of the Torreon and looked at Federico's work, essentially what he has done is he's taken these 4 maps and he's made them round again. He's taken the histories that are embedded over these different time periods and over the different ways in which we've drawn borders, and he's told the stories through people and through individual histories and through cultures and languages and food. And so in that way, he's given shape to these maps. When you walk into the Torreon, when you look at the fresco itself, you'll notice that there are different layers, there are different bands of history that go through that space. And so the lowest band is really going all the way back to the earliest histories of the Olmecs and different Aztecs and the Pueblos. Then you get to this really kind of right in the middle, there's this one band that I'm most interested in today that really is the time period that traces the point from when Mexico transitions to a territory and then to being part of the United States. So that's really that little band is what we're going to talk about today. And then the top part of the fresco gets into sort of the universals, right? When we talk about art and ideas and science and medicine, it really becomes a larger metaphysical connection. But what happens when you're in that space, because you can see through these different layers, you actually see history in a different way because it's not a flat, linear progression. You're seeing multiple layers of cultures interacting with each other in different ways over time, over space, and over place. It's also an opportunity to recognize and to acknowledge that the mythology of three peoples living peacefully together in this place is exactly that. It's a mythology, because our experiences are also born out of an incredibly violent history. And I think Federico he brilliantly doesn't avoid acknowledging that violent history, but he also seeks to find the generative places where intersections of culture actually produce something quite beautiful, which is our mestizaje, right? And not to sort of belabor the idea of mestizaje through Jose Vasconcelos, who wrote a really interesting book in which he talked about mestizaje being our strength, right? It was going to create this sort of cosmic race. I won't go so far as Vasconcelos, but he is an interesting reference when we talk about the mixture of culture and race. Next slide, please. So we'll jump right into the fresco. In that band that I mentioned, one of the really interesting moments that gets right to the point of our title, which is When the Border Crossed Us, is of course the idea of manifest destiny, which Federico has tied to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so here in New Mexico, the relationship to the concept of manifest destiny is a little bit different from some of the larger history of the rest of the country. When in around the mid-1800s, the US government basically thought that they could easily expand their territory and that New Mexicans would welcome them with open arms. But of course, it was much more complicated than that. It's true that New Mexico was fairly isolated from the Mexican Empire, with Santa Fe being over 1,400 miles north of Mexico City. The advent of Texas independence was another added complexity to the moment, because some New Mexicans actually believed that American colonizers were behind Texas becoming independent. And they didn't really want to have that kind of influx of American settlers coming into New Mexico. So this created a rather strained relationship between New Mexico and Texas, but also between the United States and Mexico. And the United States really didn't anticipate how tied New Mexicans were to Mexico as a nation. There were a couple of other things that sort of shaped the way that the conquering of Mexico in New Mexico at that time, and one of them was the Rio Arriba, or the Chimayo Rebellion. And what happened there is that the viceroyalty in Mexico basically appointed an outsider to be the new viceroyal governor of New Mexico. And New Mexicans didn't like that. They wanted to have someone who was from here to be the leadership of our state. And so there were these tensions that were happening between Mexico. But part of the mistake was that the United States read that as Mexico losing its grip on its northern territories. And so that was why around the mid-1800s, 1846, the United States decides, this is the time that's ripe for us to conquer these lands. And of course, that decision is fed by the concept of manifest destiny, which basically was this ideology that the United States should control the lands between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. There were, of course, some examples of New Mexico feeling somewhat abandoned or maybe not supported by Mexico. One example of that is the Penitente Brotherhood. In 1821, Mexico basically removes the Jesuit priests from New Mexico. And so communities in northern New Mexico were left without religious leaders in their communities. So what ends up happening is you have these brotherhoods that form. What I love about the way that Federico has represented the brotherhood in his fresco is that he focuses on the idea of community and community support, which is really what the brotherhoods were about. It's much later, and particularly in the 19th century, where these brotherhoods were basically presented as these sort of radical religious groups that were, all about self-flagellation and sort of not being connected directly to the Catholic Church. And by the 1990s, they are accepted back into the church, and actually today, their suspicion of the way that they're being depicted has started to loosen a little bit. But really, at the crux of what these brotherhoods were about were supporting community members and providing for the community and making sure that there was a spiritual life within those communities. And so when you see this as an example of Mexico not supporting the families of New Mexico, you do start to see sort of the unraveling of that connection to Mexico as a country. Next slide, please. Another example of someone who was really, there's one, sorry, can we go back once? Sorry. There's one quote that I wanted to read. Oh, actually, it is in the next one. It's okay. So Padre Martinez is another example of someone who was both concerned, but also understood why the United States was going to essentially take over New Mexico. He was a really important educator, political leader, and religious leader. He established a school in Taos, a couple of different schools actually. One of the first co-educational schools, and then he also created a school that was a college preparatory school. And when he realized that the future of New Mexico was pretty much inevitable, he basically introduced a curriculum of civic law into his school curriculum. And so some of the most important leaders and lawyers and political leaders came out of his school programs. Eventually, though, he didn't adopt some of the United States' as at this point we become a territory, and he didn't really like working with Laney, for example. And so he ends up becoming excommunicated from the church, and then practices his own religious practice, for a long time. So a lot of New Mexicans really were embedded in our own culture. They felt that they were kind of stuck between being part of the United States and not being part of the United States, being part of Mexico and not being part of Mexico. And so there's this wonderful quote by Juan Bautista Vigil, who was a New Mexican elite at the time. And he wrote to General Kearney, and he said, "Do not find it strange if there has been no manifestation of joy and enthusiasm in seeing this city occupied by your military forces. To us, the power of the Mexican Republic is dead. No matter what her condition, she was our mother." And so he expresses here that even though the United States is no longer part of Mexico, the culture and tradition and the history of Mexico is still very much a part of the New Mexican identity. And so what are some examples? I have been fascinated with the figure of La Malinche now for a little while. I'm working on a project with the Denver Art Museum to create an exhibition specifically about her. And so as I've been learning about her and reading about her, I had in the past this sort of very typical understanding of her as the dual embodiment of the mother and the whore. She was the person who basically was the translator and partner for Cortés in Mexico at the time when he was essentially conquering the Aztec people and the last emperor, Moctezuma. And so here you see Moctezuma and Malinche, and Federico very generously shared this story with me about why he did not want to include Cortés in this particular part of the mural. And it has to do with the kind of person that Cortés was and the way in which the Spanish at that time brutally massacred the Aztecs. So the story of Malinche, though, becomes quite fascinating because Even though people call her the traitor, she's also the mother of mestizaje. Right? So if we think about this term, this idea of motherhood, and how that relates back to some of these iconic figures and icons of Mexico, we see that they still emanate here in Mexico. I did not know this, but it turns out that the marachines, the dances that are performed both here and in Mexico, are related to the dispelling of the Moors in Spain. And so there are all kinds of fascinating connections to things that are happening right now and continue to happen in our culture that relate back to these histories. This is probably the worst quote I think I've ever read. But this is what Octavio Paz, and usually I have wonderful quotes by Octavio Paz, but this is what he wrote about Malinche. It's true that she gave herself voluntarily to the conquistador, but he forgot her as soon as her usefulness was over. Doña Marina becomes a figure representing the Indian women who were fascinated, violated, or seduced by the Spaniards. And as a small boy will not forgive his mother if she abandons him to search for his father, the Mexican people have not forgiven La Malinche for her betrayal. So one of the best quotes I've read about La Malinche is by a woman who says, how hard is it to be Malinche, right? You're both the mother and the traitor at the same time. And so this is a fascinating icon, and I think that over time, history will tell a different story from the one that Paz chooses to tell of her. Another figure connected to motherhood, of course, is the Virgen de Guadalupe. And this is one of the most important stories in Mexico, and has become and continues to be an important story here in New Mexico. Most of you probably know this story of young Juan Diego just outside of Mexico City, where he sees the Virgen. And of course, he goes back to tell the priest that he has to build a church for her, and the priest doesn't believe him. So he sees her again, and she tells him to pick the roses, and then the roses appear on this beautiful cape that you can still go and visit in Mexico City. This, of course, is the legend, and for many millions of people, the truth of their faith. But the Lady of Guadalupe has come to mean something much larger than that, particularly in New Mexico. You see her everywhere. And she's also come to be the symbol of standing up for social justice, standing up for those who have less, and for seeing the people that we don't often see in our historical remembrance of that time period. And we don't often talk about this, but in my discussion also with Federico, he pointed out, if you look in the Torreon, there are actually very different versions of the Virgin that are embedded within the story of the fresco. And one of them appears as the Nahual Virgin, where she is visibly more brown and is wearing a more traditional Nahual dress or costume. And so in that idea, this sense that a Nahual person had a direct connection, a direct validation for the way in which the church would see Mexico in the future is an important part of that story. I wasn't sure how I was going to do this, but I was going to find a way to figure out how to include the snake and the eagle in this discussion of how New Mexico is connected to Mexico. And I was glad to find out that it's actually, and we'll go forward and then back, there's a pretty obvious connection. This is our state, one more forward, sorry. This is our state seal. So it wasn't that hard. So the story, if we can go back now, the story of the serpent and the eagle is essentially the Mexica people were living in the northern part of Mexico, or in I think it was the southern part of Mexico. And they were trying to find a place where they were going to create their homeland. And so there's a story of basically the gods speaking to the Mexica people and telling them to look for an eagle and a snake. And that would be where they would build, basically build their empire. So Huitzilopochtli, who was the Mexica leader, supposedly saw an eagle and a snake landing on a nopal cactus. Unfortunately, it was right in the middle of a swamp, in which became Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. And so they figured out how to engineer and fill up that swampy area to become one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the Americas. And so when you see, this eagle and the serpent on our New Mexico state seal, I find it quite fascinating that you see the eagle, the serpent on the nopal cactus, but looming just behind them is this gold eagle, which represents the United States. So within our our official state seal, you already see those layers of colonialism that are playing out with that sort of iconography that they're playing with. And so this idea of that sort of overbearing eagle, I'm gonna make a bad political joke, but it kind of reminds me of when, Donald Trump was looming over Hillary Clinton in the debates at the last election. There's this sort of ominous figure that's clearly, extending its strength and power over this other symbol, which has really comparing, if we can go back just one more time, comparing, the way that the Mexican flag chooses to render the eagle and the snake in Federico's mural compared to our state seal is quite fascinating. It goes as it grows, and I guess it's a reference to the way that lightning kind of gets bigger when it strikes across the sky. I have no idea how I know that, but it was in there. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo also is interesting because with that treaty, it honored the land grants that eventually became an important part of the culture here in New Mexico. I know a little bit about this as both of my parents' families were part of the Atrisco land grant. And so there were anywhere between the 1600s all the way through to the early 1800s, there were numerous land grants that had been issued. And basically the point of that was that people couldn't just go out and claim, whatever land they felt like. They had to have a permission, they had to have a grant, either from the Viceroyalty in Mexico City or from the king himself. What's fascinating about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is that it did attempt, or at least it supposedly honored these land grants. The reality, though, is that over time, a lot of those land grants have been diluted in all kinds of ways, whether it's individuals buying shares from families and then trying to sell them at, for higher prices to other people. The Atrisco land grant had the really challenging history of being managed by a corporation called Westland Corp, which then eventually bought out those land grant owners. And until that time, and there are still some who are fighting this fight, but it had been the longest continuously held land grant in the country. Of course, the idea of settlement doesn't mean that there isn't also a sense of struggle and violence. So this section of the mural actually points to the Pueblo Revolt itself. I've been grappling with this topic recently because at my museum we have a history exhibit. And in our history exhibit, it often tells the stories of the histories of New Mexico from the perspective of the winner. Right? So when the Pueblos revolted, they weren't the winners. And so this story gets kind of downplayed. And so I've been trying to think about how do we show this moment in history as one in which We don't show that the Spaniards were simply the victims or the winners, or that the Pueblos were simply the victims or the winners. How do we add a more complex, layered, and nuanced recognition of that history and of the violence that was born out of that history? Of course, in my conversation with Federico, he said the way that he handled that very question was to basically use this imagery of a skeleton, right? And this idea of death here with, you can see where the eyes are red, and it includes 3 dates, 1599, 1680, and 1692. And those 3 dates are essentially, 1599 is the massacre of the Acoma people by including Oñate, who was part of the conquistadors who wielded that action upon the Acoma people. 1680 is the Pueblo Revolt, in which Spaniards were expelled from certain parts of New Mexico. And then 1692 is when the Spanish take control. But the idea here was to show that this history was incredibly violent, and that both sides had losses and that both sides had victories. And what did that mean and what did it look like? The Pueblo Revolt for me is becoming much more of an important historical moment to rethink and to look at and to focus on for a lot of different reasons. But it was really one of the only 2 successful revolts in the United States, in the history of the United States. The other one, or not the United States, the Americas. The other one was the Haitian Revolt, in which they were able to literally push out the colonizers, at least for some time. All right, next slide. This, we've seen sort of Padre Martinez in the last slide when I talked about him earlier, but if you look at the 2 figures just below Padre Martinez, and there's a banner that they're holding on to, and it has the word compadrazgo. And when I talked to Federico about his mural and about the importance of what message he was hoping to get across, he pointed out this section of the mural to me. And he said, even though we had this violent history that is a shared history, we also have moments where we have learned to be together, to share, to culturally have exchanges that are regenerative, and so he bundled all of that sentiment into this one word, compadrazgo. How do we learn to acknowledge and see the violence of this history, but then find ways where we can find commonality and move forward in a way that is actually a healing process, as opposed to one that tears us apart. And so I think that's one of the really beautiful things about this mural, is that as you look through the layers and the history of colonization, different ways in which different cultures have both clashed and come together, you can start to find these moments. And this is something that weighs, very heavily on me at a time when we see in our southern border what's happening, and seeing walls being built in a place where in the past we've had this kind of cultural exchange that has made us better, that has also made us be part of a larger discussion in terms of Mexico and the culture of Mexico and the history of Mexico. So I want to thank you, Federico, for allowing us to be able to see those layers of history in the way that you've constructed these maps, as I originally called them, which is more about the people and the stories, in a circular fashion, so that we see those layers and those interactions in ways that can help us to reshape the way that we think about history. Because I think we often see it very much in a linear kind of timeline, chronological fashion. And so I know that I've only barely tipped the iceberg, but hopefully this will help stir your imagination so that when you go into that mural and you take a look at some of these images, you can make those connections to to Mexico. How are we doing on time? Okay. I just want to talk about one last figure, and then we can have some questions and discussion if you like. The Benito Juarez is one of the figures that's also included in Federico's mural. And this is interesting because they're really, when we talk about Benito Juarez, it's very much an icon that's embedded in Mexican history, right? He also carries his own mythology with him because he was the first native president of Mexico. He inherited an incredible mess. His leadership was literally interrupted by the French occupation of Mexico, the time period known as the Maximiliano. And so there's this really, sort of fascinating figure who then comes and actually goes to New Orleans for some time. Like there's a sculpture, a monument to Benito Juarez in New Orleans. And that's because that's where he escaped when he was exiled by Maximilian, when Maximilian came to power. And so Juarez kind of embodies this idea of the rule of law, the idea of social justice. He was a much more complex figure than that when you really look at the history. But that's what he's come to symbolize. It's what he's come to be known for. And so it does have sort of the Cinco de Mayo, September date that's here. A lot of people think that that's Mexican independence. It's not. It's actually when Juarez defeated the French in Puebla, and it was not the end of the war by any means. It was kind of the beginning, and so it's sort of that complex history. So I was fascinated to find that Federico had included Juarez in his mural because it does come back to this idea of the, you see the dove in his hand. It's like, what are the connections? What are the things that we can see in Mexico that can also reflect on and help us relate to the histories here in New Mexico? So Juarez becomes that kind of figure where you see that leadership is coming not just from the top down, but also from the bottom up, because he himself came from very meager beginnings and finally made it through law school and then became president of Mexico. And so seeing and celebrating that indigenous history, I think is a fascinating story to tell within the context of this much larger swirling history that's happening in that space. All right, so I think I will leave it there. We have a small group, so if people have questions or discussion that they want to have, if want to go back and look at any of these images, we can do that in more depth. No thoughts? No questions? Orlando?
I grew up in Chimayo.
Okay.
And can you tell us anything more about that revolt?
The Chimayo Rebellion?
Yeah.
All I really know about it is that, again, it was the person that the Viceroyalty of Mexico that they had put into power, his name was Perez. And so at the time, New Mexico had already had a long history of selecting our own political leaders from within our area. And so I think it just really upset the communities. And so then they basically revolted and ran the Perez out. And then following that, a New Mexican was placed in the lead. But the United States kind of misread that, because they took that as New Mexico really revolting against Mexico, and that was sort of what also fed this imaginary that that New Mexico wanted to be part of the United States. And so that was sort of a mistake on Kearney's part in terms of thinking that, oh, this is just going to be an easy waltz in there and add another section of a third of Mexico to, at that point it became a third of Mexico to the United States. So I mean, that map is incredibly telling when you go back and see the amount of land that was part of Mexico. Yes?
Related to that. I always thought of New Mexico in terms of its name. And so when it was acquired by the U.S., was there any
Well, can you go back to the map? Oh wait, actually you were right on it. I'm sorry, you had the right map. So you can see here that when New Mexico was part of New Spain, this is the Kingdom of Mexico down here, and this was New Mexico. So it wasn't exactly the shape that we know of from our political borders, but this area already had that name. And then in the history of it, there was a lot of, remember when I talked about the tension between New Mexico and Texas? I think it's about a third or maybe more than a third of New Mexico was actually part of the Texas territory. And Texas was trying to take more of New Mexico, so that's also created that tension there. But then for a while, when New Mexico and Arizona were a territory that were linked, there was also some question about where the maps, where the borders would be drawn there. Eventually, they settled on what our current boundaries are, but that's where the name New Mexico came from, because that's what it was called when we were part of New Spain. And
because we have now Arizona, Texas, right? So I guess
yeah.
the actual nomenclature is interesting to me.
Yeah.
There is California there, but where did Texas and Arizona, those names come from?
They were developed, historically over time, and Texas was its own country for a while. So when they broke off from Mexico, then they picked their own name. And the word Mexico comes from Mexica, right, which was the name of the Aztec people before they were the Aztec Empire. So the Mexica people were the precursors to the Aztecs, I guess. But that's where the word Mexico comes from, Mexica.
New
Yeah.
What I find interesting is that you have the Kingdom of Mexico all the way south, New Mexico all the way north, and everything in between is Spanish. Navarra, Vizcaya, Extremadura, León, Galicia, Santander.
Yeah. The other thing too, mentioning this is not related at all, but when I was looking at the history of the Virgen, it turns out that she's also incredibly a figure in the Philippines. And so she has taken on, this sort of, this power in a way in different parts of the world, certainly throughout Latin America and here, but also the Philippines. So that's kind of random, but. Mark.
Can you show us on the map what was French territory? I'm not clear on that. Before 1763. It says United States, but I don't think that's exactly right.
Well, at this point, Louisiana and Florida, Louisiana is already part of the United States at this point. You're asking me to talk about a map from earlier?
Do you have an order map?
I don't. Not the.
French?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I can tell you loosely that the French were, around Louisiana, and then sort of that upper, what's called Missouri Territory on this map. That's where most of the French had settled, and obviously, Quebec and Canada.
But in 1763, the British knocked out the French.
Yeah.
And then there was a question as to what was going to happen to that former French territory.
Right, but at this time, by this time we've already see what becomes the vision of the manifest destiny, right?
Right, that's the origins of manifest.
That you already see what this delineation is going to look like in terms of the United States. And I guess this is 1819, so within, 30 years of this, you have all of this becoming part of the United States as a territory. Of course, we were a territory for something like 64 years, which is another whole story about mestizaje and why we don't become a state in the way that Texas or other folks did. I don't know if Federico wants to join me, but if he's interested, we could entertain other questions as well, specifically about the the fresco, or the process of the fresco, if there are any. Does everyone know the process of painting a fresco? I think most of you are here probably have seen or heard about it, but the way that he does it with the traditional sort of wet plaster and pigments, and seeing how his experimentation with the pigments is really fascinating. Yeah. All right. Go see the fresco.